The story goes like this. Long before anyone could read or write, before science, before medicine, before the concept of fairness or justice as we know it, two people were placed in a perfect garden, and somehow they ruined it for everyone who would ever be born after them. It's a story most of us have heard as children. Adam and Eve, a talking serpent, a piece of forbidden fruit, and a punishment so enormous it would infect all of humanity, not just them, but their children and their children's children. A moral debt passed through time like a curse. That's what the doctrine of original sin is. The idea that every human being is born guilty, not because of anything they've done, but because of something a pair of mythical ancestors supposedly did thousands of years ago. It sounds poetic if you don't think about it too long. But when you do, it falls apart almost instantly. First, let's take the basic logic of it. If someone commits a crime, say theft or murder, we hold that person accountable. We don't imprison their grandchildren for it. We don't tell them they're born guilty because of what their great-great-grandparent did. Yet, that's exactly what original sin claims, that guilt is hereditary, that moral responsibility can be biologically transmitted. It's a strange kind of justice. It's like punishing an entire nation for one man's crime, forever. The story claims Adam and Eve disobeyed a divine command not to eat from a certain tree. That disobedience supposedly corrupted their nature, and that corruption was genetically passed down to every human being, meaning, by this logic, babies are born not pure, but broken. That's the foundation of a lot of theology, that humans are fundamentally depraved, unworthy, sinful from birth. And this one idea has shaped entire civilizations. It's justified control, guilt, punishment, and even violence, all in the name of redeeming people from something they never chose to inherit. If we look closely, the story starts to reveal what it really is: a tool to explain suffering in a world that didn't yet understand disease, weather, or human behavior. When bad things happened, people needed an explanation. Why do we suffer? Why do we die? Why does life hurt? It's a natural human question, and because we sinned in Eden, became the earliest attempt at an answer. But the deeper absurdity is that it shifts moral focus from action to existence itself. You don't need to do anything wrong to be wrong. You just need to be human. That's not moral philosophy. That's psychological manipulation. It teaches people to see themselves as defective from birth, and to depend on the very institution that tells them they're defective for salvation. When you step back, it starts to look less like a spiritual truth and more like an incredibly effective system of control. Because if you convince people that they are inherently broken, they'll spend their lives trying to be fixed, and they'll turn to whoever claims to hold the cure. The problem is, when guilt is built into existence, no amount of goodness ever feels like enough. You can be kind, generous, loving, and still feel undeserving because you were told from day one that you were born stained. This isn't harmless myth-making. Studies in psychology show that early religious guilt correlates strongly with anxiety, shame, and self-punishing behavior later in life. When people internalize that their thoughts, desires, or very nature are sinful, they live with a constant sense of moral surveillance, even when no one is watching. Let's think about the origin of this doctrine in historical context. The concept of inherited guilt didn't really solidify until centuries after the Hebrew Bible was written. The Jewish tradition doesn't teach original sin the way Christianity does. It focuses more on moral responsibility for one's own actions. But when early Christian thinkers, particularly Augustine, began shaping doctrine in the 4th century, they needed a framework to explain why people needed salvation through Christ. And Augustine, brilliant, tortured, guilt-ridden, gave it to them. He argued that through Adam's sin, all humanity became guilty, and that guilt could only be cleansed through baptism and faith. It was theological genius, but also psychological poison. It made salvation a necessity, not a choice. It made guilt permanent, and religion the only escape route. Think about how that affects the way someone sees the world. If you're told you were born wrong, that your instincts are corrupt, that even your thoughts can condemn you, then freedom isn't possible. You live in constant suspicion of yourself. You start believing that even joy, curiosity, or pleasure might be sinful. You can't trust your mind, your body, or your nature, and that kind of distrust breeds obedience. That's not spirituality, that's fear management. Even the image of God in the story becomes confusing. If a perfect, all-knowing being created Adam and Eve, fully aware they would fail, then punishing them, and all of humanity, for doing exactly what was foreseeable, is the definition of absurdity. It's moral theater. It's a cosmic setup. If a parent left a piece of candy on the table and told their toddler not to touch it, knowing full well they would, and then cursed all their descendants for thousands of years for that act, we'd call that parent abusive, not loving. Yet when it's divine, it's called justice. The deeper irony is that original sin devalues the very thing religion claims to celebrate: free will. If your nature is corrupt by default, then your choices are never truly free. You're already biased toward wrongdoing. You're guilty before you act. So, what kind of moral responsibility is that? A just system can't punish someone for their nature, only for their choices. But the doctrine erases that distinction entirely. It blurs the line between being human and being evil. And this mindset seeps into how societies treat people. It's reflected in purity culture, in obsession with control, in shame-based morality systems that police sexuality, thought, and emotion. The core message is always the same. You're not enough as you are. That's the quiet legacy of original sin. It doesn't just shape theology, it shapes self-image. When children are told from an early age that they are sinful, that their body is a source of temptation, that their thoughts can offend God, they internalize shame as part of identity. And shame, once deeply rooted, doesn't lead to moral behavior. It leads to repression, fear, and self-loathing. The irony is, the more someone believes they're corrupt, the more likely they are to act out of guilt, secrecy, and suppression, the very behaviors the doctrine claims to prevent. But there's something powerful about recognizing this pattern, about seeing that the supposed curse isn't real, that you were never born broken. Because when you strip away the story, what's left is something profoundly human: curiosity, imperfection, learning, empathy, desire, consciousness. None of that needs redemption. It just needs understanding. And maybe that's the point that religion missed, the idea that imperfection isn't sin, it's growth. The doctrine of original sin turns existence into an apology. But existence doesn't need to apologize for itself. We don't need to be saved from being human. We just need permission to be human. Once you start questioning original sin, everything built on top of it starts to wobble. If humanity isn't born guilty, then there's no need for divine punishment. If there's no punishment, there's no need for a savior. If there's no savior, the entire framework of sin and redemption collapses into myth, not morality. That's why the doctrine is so fiercely defended. It's not just a spiritual belief, it's the foundation of an entire economy of guilt and forgiveness. Take it away, and centuries of theology lose their scaffolding. But what's remarkable is how few people ever truly interrogate it. They're taught to feel guilt before they can even form critical thought. And when you grow up inside that framework, guilt feels like truth. It feels natural, like gravity. Yet guilt isn't proof of sin, it's proof of conditioning. We can see the remnants of this conditioning everywhere, in the way people apologize for existing, for having emotions, for feeling desire, for making mistakes. They carry invisible weights that were handed to them by traditions built on metaphors mistaken for facts. It's fascinating that the same story that begins with a human being gaining knowledge by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge is framed as the original transgression. In other words, curiosity itself is what condemned us. And maybe that's the hidden message that went unnoticed, that enlightenment was seen as rebellion. The very act of questioning, of seeking truth beyond authority, became the first sin. It's not hard to see why institutions would want to preserve that lesson. For thousands of years, this idea has been repeated so many times that it stopped being questioned. It became invisible, like the air people breathe, yet its effects are everywhere. When you teach someone that they are fundamentally flawed, you make them dependent. They'll spend their life trying to earn a forgiveness that was never necessary to begin with. And when you convince entire cultures of that, you control their behavior without force. You don't need chains, just guilt. Even today, we see the modern echoes of this mindset in the way people talk about human nature as inherently bad, as if empathy, cooperation, and love are exceptions, not the rule. But evolutionary biology paints a different picture. Human beings evolved as social animals. Cooperation, not corruption, is what allowed us to survive. Our moral instincts, empathy, fairness, compassion, aren't divine gifts. They're natural adaptations. We don't need a savior to tell us not to harm others. We evolved empathy because it helps communities thrive. Morality isn't supernatural. It's practical, it's human, and yet the story of original sin flips that entirely. It tells us that our instincts are dangerous, that our desires are traps, that our curiosity leads to ruin. It's like someone taking the story of human progress and rewriting it as a confession. And because it's so deeply embedded in the collective psyche, it seeps into everyday life, far beyond religion. When people feel unworthy of love, when they believe they must earn acceptance, when they can't forgive themselves for being imperfect, that's the emotional residue of the same idea. Original sin isn't just a theological doctrine, it's a psychological scar. It's the whisper that says, "You're never enough." But what if that whisper is a lie? What if being human, with all the confusion, beauty, and imperfection, was never a flaw, but the point? What if knowledge wasn't the fall, but the awakening? That flips the story entirely. The serpent becomes the liberator, not the villain. The fruit becomes enlightenment, not disobedience. And the punishment becomes the birth of consciousness. That's not sin, that's evolution. It's interesting how religions that build on guilt often suppress the same qualities that make us most human. Curiosity, pleasure, individuality, questioning. Those things threaten control because they empower people to think for themselves. And when people start thinking for themselves, they stop believing they were born broken. Throughout history, you can trace how this idea shaped societies, how it justified hierarchies. If people are born sinful, then someone must be holier than others. Priests, popes, kings by divine right. It builds a pyramid where the top claims purity and the bottom carries inherited guilt. It's the perfect system. Those at the top are the gatekeepers of forgiveness, and everyone else is forever in debt. And yet no one ever stops to ask, forgiveness for what exactly? For being human? For thinking? For existing? The concept of inherited guilt doesn't even make sense biologically. Guilt isn't a genetic trait. There's no sin gene that passes through DNA. What passes through generations is culture, not cosmic guilt. It's a learned belief, one that gets transmitted through stories, sermons, and fear. That's why it survives. Not because it's true, but because it's taught early and often enough that it feels true. When you peel back the layers of the myth, what remains is a very human attempt to make sense of suffering, to answer the question, why do bad things happen to good people? The tragedy is that instead of finding comfort, humanity was given blame. Instead of saying, life is hard, but we can face it together, the story said, life is hard because you deserve it. It's the ultimate twist. It turns pain into punishment. And yet, even after all this time, people still struggle with that message. The inner voice that says suffering is deserved, that joy must be earned, that you're guilty before you begin. But that voice isn't divine. It's ancient storytelling echoing through generations. When you start to question it, you notice how absurd it really is. The idea that newborn babies, perfect, innocent beings, could somehow carry moral guilt. The idea that a child must be washed of sin before they can belong. The idea that love itself must come with conditions. It's an insult to both reason and empathy. If morality means anything, it must start with personal responsibility, not inherited blame. You're accountable for your actions, not your ancestry. And if there is such a thing as grace, it should mean acceptance of our shared imperfection, not eternal punishment for an ancient metaphor. In that sense, rejecting the idea of original sin isn't about rebellion. It's about reclaiming reality. It's about recognizing that we don't need to be forgiven for being human. We just need to live honestly, with empathy, curiosity, and awareness. Because if there's any true fall in the story, it wasn't eating from the tree of knowledge. It was believing the lie that knowledge was forbidden. When you begin to see that, something shifts. The story loses its grip. You start realizing that you don't need to be saved from anything invisible. You just need to unlearn what was never true in the first place. And that's the quiet revolution, not against faith, but against fear. Because fear is what keeps the myth alive. Fear of punishment, fear of being wrong, fear of being alone without a divine parent watching over you. But when you let go of that fear, you find something much more grounding. Responsibility, not inherited responsibility. Personal responsibility, the kind that actually leads to growth. You start to see morality not as obedience to an ancient decree, but as empathy in action. You stop needing cosmic approval to do good. You do good because you understand the shared experience of being human. That's what's real. It's almost strange how the doctrine of original sin tries to turn awareness into crime. The moment of awakening, the bite of the fruit, becomes the fall from grace, as if self-awareness itself is a problem. But that's the moment we became conscious beings. It's the birth of moral understanding. Without it, we'd be just another species acting on instinct. The story actually describes evolution perfectly, not in the biological sense, but in the psychological one. The fall is the moment we became aware of choice, consequence, and identity. And instead of celebrating that, religion turned it into guilt. That's how deeply inverted the story became. The awakening of consciousness turned into a cosmic catastrophe. Think about the power of that inversion. If knowledge itself is branded as disobedience, people will fear learning. If curiosity is labeled sin, people will avoid questions. If pleasure is seen as temptation, people will suppress joy. And if you can make people fear their own nature, they'll never question the structure built above them. That's how myths become mechanisms of power. You can see this same structure in many traditions that came later. The idea that salvation is external, that you can't trust yourself, that your thoughts are dangerous. It's the same pattern, just wearing different cultural masks. It always begins with guilt and ends with obedience. But underneath it all, what's really being suppressed is autonomy, the freedom to think and to feel without shame, because a person who trusts their own mind doesn't need to be controlled. Once you recognize that, you begin to understand how liberation works. It's not about rejecting everything that came before. It's about realizing that morality, meaning, and goodness don't require permission from an invisible judge. They're born out of our own shared reality. The simple recognition that others feel as we do, hurt as we do, and hope as we do. That's morality. That's compassion. That's all we ever needed. No inherited guilt, no metaphysical stain, just connection. And ironically, that understanding makes life feel more sacred, not less. When you're not living under the shadow of divine guilt, existence itself starts to feel precious. The briefness of life, the fragility of consciousness, the beauty of ordinary kindness, those things become enough. You don't need a promise of paradise to see that this is already extraordinary. It's also worth asking what kind of world we'd have if we stopped teaching children that they were born bad. What if, instead of guilt, we taught responsibility? Instead of shame, empathy? What if a child grew up believing that they weren't broken but capable? That single shift would change everything. It would change how people love, how they forgive, how they live. Because guilt doesn't make people better. It makes them afraid. And fear rarely leads to moral clarity. It leads to secrecy, repression, and self-denial. The most tragic thing about the myth of original sin is how effectively it replaces curiosity with confession. It teaches people to say, "Forgive me," instead of "help me understand." And the moment you replace curiosity with confession, progress stops. Humanity's greatest leaps, scientific, moral, social, have all come from the very impulse the story condemned. The desire to know, to question, to seek truth beyond authority. That's what the fruit of knowledge represents. It wasn't poison, it was potential. So maybe the real sin isn't knowledge. Maybe it's ignorance, willingly turning away from understanding because it's uncomfortable. And maybe redemption isn't baptism or ritual. It's awareness, the courage to face reality without the filter of fear. That's what growth looks like. Not perfection, not purity, just honesty. The more you see it, the more absurd the entire structure of inherited sin becomes. It's not even a moral doctrine. It's a psychological inheritance, passed through culture, reinforced by authority, sustained by repetition. It's the oldest guilt trip in history, and yet even now, it shapes how billions see themselves. It shapes how people raise their children, how they vote, how they view human nature itself. It's one of the most influential ideas ever invented, and one of the least questioned. But when you finally do question it, the spell breaks. You start to see that morality doesn't need mythology, that love doesn't need guilt, that forgiveness doesn't require divine permission. And maybe that's why the story has lasted so long, because it tells people something they secretly fear, that they are responsible for their own lives, that no one is coming to fix them. That's a heavy truth at first, but it's also freeing, because once you accept it, you realize that if no one is coming to save you, then you're free to save yourself and others in real, tangible ways, not through confession, through compassion, not through ritual, through reason, not through inherited guilt, through genuine understanding. When the doctrine of original sin finally crumbles under its own weight, what remains isn't despair, it's possibility. Because the moment you stop believing you were born guilty, you begin to understand that you were born capable of growth, of love, of moral awareness, without anyone declaring you pure or impure. That's the real redemption story. And it doesn't begin with a forbidden fruit. It begins the moment you realize the story was never about sin at all. It was about awakening. Once you see that awakening for what it is, the story starts to feel less like a curse and more like a mirror. It reflects the human condition, our curiosity, our mistakes, our hunger for meaning. But it was distorted by fear. The myth was never evil in itself. It was just misunderstood and then weaponized. Because the truth is, there's no cosmic crime to atone for. The fall was simply the first step toward self-awareness, and every generation since has been trying to understand what that means. When stripped of dogma, that moment in the garden becomes a symbol of the birth of choice, of humanity discovering itself, not as obedient creatures, but as thinking ones. And that, more than any myth of guilt or punishment, is the true origin story of morality. You can see this transformation in philosophy too. As thinkers began to step away from the church's grasp, they started reframing what it means to be human. Enlightenment philosophers like Spinoza and later humanists saw people not as fallen, but as imperfect beings capable of progress through reason and compassion. They replaced sin with psychology, damnation with development, punishment with understanding. The shift was profound and dangerous to those who built power on guilt, because a population that no longer believes it's broken becomes impossible to control. That's what makes the myth of original sin so persistent. It's not just a belief about the past, it's a mechanism for the present. It keeps people small, it keeps them apologetic for their own existence. And once you internalize that, you start seeing its fingerprints everywhere, in the way people apologize for being confident, in the way sexuality is treated as shameful, in the way thinking differently is treated as rebellion. All of that is rooted in the same narrative, the one that says deviation equals sin. But deviation is how progress happens. Every moral leap humanity has ever made, abolition, equality, human rights, began as a defiance of sacred order. If the story of Eden had been taken as a metaphor for growth instead of guilt, the world might have evolved very differently. Instead of centuries of shame, we might have had centuries of self-discovery. It's not that the story of original sin needs to be erased, it needs to be reclaimed. Because within the myth is a hidden truth. Knowledge is transformative. Awareness is dangerous only to those who depend on ignorance to maintain power. Maybe that's why, in the story, the serpent, the bringer of knowledge, was demonized. Every empire, every system of control needs its serpent. The one who asks questions, the one who encourages curiosity, the one who whispers, "You could know more." And that whisper terrifies institutions more than anything. There's something deeply human about that tension between obedience and awareness, comfort and truth. Original sin turns that tension into guilt, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be seen as the price of consciousness. Awareness is messy. It brings doubt, confusion, and discomfort, but it's also the source of wisdom. The story tried to warn us away from the tree of knowledge, but maybe the lesson should have been the opposite, that growth always costs innocence, and that's okay. Innocence isn't purity, it's just ignorance by another name. When you think about it, the myth itself contains its undoing. If humanity was cursed with awareness, then awareness is also the key to undo the curse. The more we understand, scientifically, psychologically, morally, the less power the myth holds. Every act of understanding is another bite from that same tree, and it's been happening ever since. Each generation taking another bite, each discovery, each question, each new idea a small rebellion against the idea that knowledge is forbidden. That's why original sin feels so outdated now, because we've eaten the fruit again and again, and the world hasn't ended, it's expanded. The more you think about it, the more absurd it becomes that people are still taught to feel unworthy over a story that predates plumbing. A myth written by people who didn't understand the stars, the brain, or the origins of their own morality. They were doing the best they could with what they had. But the world has changed. Our understanding has changed. And holding on to their guilt while ignoring our knowledge is like living in the shadow of a candle when the sun is already up. You can see how this kind of inherited guilt has shaped modern problems too. The way people relate to the environment, for instance. Many religious narratives teach that humans are separate from nature, fallen from grace, needing to dominate or redeem creation. But if you drop the lens of sin, suddenly you see it differently. Humanity isn't a mistake within nature. It's an expression of it. We're not fallen from the world. We are the world, conscious of itself. And that realization changes everything. It turns the story of sin into a story of belonging. In that sense, the absurdity of original sin isn't just in its theology, it's in its missed opportunity. It could have been a story about learning, about the pain that comes with awareness, about the beauty of imperfection, but instead it was twisted into a doctrine of shame. It told people to distrust themselves instead of understanding themselves. And so generation after generation grew up believing that the most human parts of themselves, curiosity, desire, individuality, were sources of guilt instead of growth. But that guilt isn't permanent. It's a story, and stories can be rewritten. We can take back the narrative and say, the fruit wasn't forbidden, it was a gift. The serpent wasn't evil, it was awakening. The exile from paradise wasn't a punishment, it was evolution. The first step toward awareness, toward choice, toward freedom. That's the story worth telling. Not that we fell, but that we rose. That knowledge didn't damn us, it made us human. Because if you really think about it, the only thing more absurd than original sin is not realizing that the entire story was about liberation all along. And maybe that's the quiet truth buried beneath thousands of years of guilt, that the only real paradise is the one we create for each other, here and now. Not by denying what we are, but by finally accepting it. Because we were never born broken, we were born unfinished. And that's not a sin, that's the point.